Now, let all those who love me follow me!
She is a famous female hero in French history, a legendary figure revered as a saint. Facing the fleeing French soldiers, she single-handedly joined the battlefield. The soldiers, seeing her arrival, were greatly inspired, while the pursuing enemy began to panic and quickly raised the drawbridge. She commanded the soldiers to go to the other side of the drawbridge. Seeing the raised drawbridge, the commander did not understand why they still needed to cross. Immediately, she threw out her flag, and with one horse, charged towards the wall. The warhorse, as if divinely aided, leaped over the wall under her furious roar. Joan drew her long sword and cut the ropes of the drawbridge. As the drawbridge fell, the two armies began to clash. Under her leadership, the soldiers fought fiercely, and the enemy was routed, fleeing in disarray and abandoning the fortress. With the enemy's flag being chopped down by an axe, it officially declared that the fortress had returned to France. And the one who led the French army to victory was Joan, known as the European Mulan. The reason she could revive the low morale of the French was due to her legendary experiences. Joan had a happy and harmonious family when she was young. Her favorite thing to do every day was to confess to the priest. After confession, she would run wildly in the flower field like a fairy. Even if she stumbled and fell down the hill, it did not affect her mood. The moment Joan lay down, the scene changed instantly, with the sounds of bells, wind, and clouds rolling, as if summoned. When Joan woke up, she found a sharp sword by her side. Driven by curiosity, Joan pointed the sword at the sky. In an instant, time and space were distorted. In the blink of an eye, she was no longer in the flower field but in a dense forest. A pack of wolves rushed towards her, charging towards Joan's rear. Without hesitation, Joan followed with her sword drawn. She discovered that the English army was attacking her village. Cries of anguish filled the air. And her only sister was brutally killed. Witnessing all this, Joan was determined to avenge her sister. At that time in France, after the disastrous Battle of Agincourt, the neighboring Burgundy took the opportunity to invade from the north along with England. They easily occupied Paris. King Charles VI of France was powerless to resist and had to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which almost ceded the entire kingdom. The land north of the Loire River became an English colony, and Henry V effectively controlled all of France. France had become part of the Anglo-French Union, subject to plunder and division by the invaders. 2 years later, Henry V and Charles VI died in the same year, and the child Louis inherited the throne, becoming the king of both England and France. As the Dauphin of France, Charles VII was unwilling to hand France over to a child. Thus, England, in a fit of rage, invaded France again with Burgundy. At this time, Charles VII had not been crowned and could not be called king. The holy city of Reims, where the coronation ceremony was to be held, was in English hands, and all of France was leaderless, shrouded in darkness. Meanwhile, a rumor spread among the people of France. A maiden from Lorraine named Joan had received divine revelations and would lead France to reclaim its lost territories. To verify the rumor, Prince Charles had his trusted aides disguise themselves as him and mix with the crowd. If Joan truly had divine revelations, she would recognize the real prince. Indeed, Joan immediately saw that the person sitting on the throne was not the prince and found the real Charles among the crowd. The onlookers were astonished. Joan swore allegiance to Prince Charles, declaring that she would lift the siege of Orleans and that Charles would be crowned king. Inspired, Prince Charles appointed Joan as the military commander. Joan then assembled the French main forces and marched straight to Orleans. This was the famous Battle of Orleans in the 100 Years' War. Just moments ago, Joan had assembled the French main forces and arrived outside the city of Orleans. Because Joan was a woman, the soldiers did not trust her. During discussions about strategy, they deliberately ignored her. Joan was incredibly angry, so in her fury, she cut off her long hair with a dagger to make herself look like a man. She wrote a letter to the Duke of Bedford, the new content of which was to urge him to abandon the war.
I will write to you.
Joan suddenly woke up from her rest, sensing that the war had already begun. It turned out that the general had not followed Joan's orders. He had secretly commanded the troops to start the battle, resulting in heavy casualties. She single-handedly approached the enemy fortress and urged the English to return to their country. The result was predictable. The English refused. Rejected, Joan returned to the front lines and delivered an impassioned speech to her soldiers.
Now, let all those who love me follow me!
Inspired, the French soldiers charged fiercely towards the fortress. The English soldiers threw large stones down the chutes, which struck the French soldiers, but this did not deter the French soldiers' resolve. Ladders were placed against the walls one by one, and they climbed with courage and without retreat. Soon, catapults joined the battle. Joan, seeing that the tower was not falling despite the attacks and that the few soldiers who managed to reach the top were being killed, joined the battle. She followed the soldiers up the ladders, and at that moment, an English archer had her in his sights. Joan was still commanding the soldiers to follow her in the attack when she turned and was struck by an arrow in the chest. Seeing the arrow in her, Joan involuntarily let go and fell from the ladder. The soldiers caught her and carried the severely wounded Joan back to the camp. Immediately, she pulled the arrow from her body and screamed to return to the battlefield before fainting. In her dream, Joan entered a tunnel, at the other end of which was her already deceased sister. This was Joan's childhood trauma. Awakening, Joan found that her arrow wound had miraculously healed. She woke the still sleeping French soldiers and ordered them to pull the siege tower in the opposite direction towards the fortress. The French soldiers looked incredulous, and the English officers mocked Joan. The next moment, the soldiers worked together to push the siege tower down, and the tip of the tower smashed the drawbridge. The English, realizing their mistake, immediately abandoned the outer defenses and closed the city gates. After the drawbridge fell, Joan ordered the firing of flaming arrows to burn the city gates. The English had also prepared a large weapon inside the city, causing heavy casualties among the French soldiers. However, this did not make the French soldiers retreat. Seeing that the city gate could not be conquered for a long time, the French prepared heavy siege vehicles, set them on fire and directly broke through the city gate. The stunned Joan was pushed by the soldiers into the fortress. The remaining English soldiers were still resisting fiercely, pouring burning oil on the French soldiers and setting them on fire. But this could not change the outcome. Joan's French soldiers were fearless. The soldiers behind dodged the flames and fiercely fought the enemy. After this battle, France finally had a moment of triumph. This was one of the longest wars in human history. After the battlefield was a mess, with corpses strewn everywhere. Although Joan led the French to victory, she also fell into deep self-blame. War is cruel, and although she had not killed anyone, the soldiers were fighting under her orders. In desperation, Joan found a pastor and asked the entire army to stop fighting and confess their sins. In the eyes of the soldiers, Joan was not in a good state at this time. Everyone understood that the Anglo-French War had always been so cruel. At this time, the English reinforcements had arrived at the outskirts of Orleans. Joan chose to go alone with her banner to negotiate with the English. She rode to the English lines and conveyed God's will to them.
I have a message for your King Henry. It is a message from God. Go home. Go now. In peace. If you do not go now, you will be buried in this field. I've seen enough blood. But if you want more, I can't stop you. I can only warn you that it will be your blood, not ours.
After hearing what Joan said, both camps looked at each other in bewilderment. If words alone could work, why would the war have lasted until now? The English commander waved his hand, and the English longbowmen stepped forward. The French soldiers also prepared for battle, and a major confrontation was imminent.
Please.
Joan was still pleading desperately when suddenly the English cavalry turned around and left the battlefield. The French soldiers were overjoyed and began to cheer. This was truly a miracle. At this moment, they truly believed that Joan was indeed the savior of France. Thus, Joan won the Battle of Orleans. Although it was unbelievable, she had done it.
She was on her white horse.
The news quickly reached the palace, and Prince Charles was overjoyed. He had gambled everything and finally achieved such a victory. The regent, the Duke of Bedford, was furious and ordered Joan to be captured and burned at the stake. Joan returned home to a hero's welcome from the people, and Prince Charles was crowned king in the Grand Cathedral of the holy city of Reims. But Joan did not choose to stop. She took advantage of the momentum to march north, planning to retake Paris. However, Charles VII did not want to continue the war and chose to negotiate. He did not send reinforcements, and the battle to retake Paris ended in Joan's defeat. Furious, Joan confronted Charles VII, asking why he did not send troops to support her. Charles VII remained calm, believing that peaceful diplomacy was the way to regain the territory. Hearing his words, Joan trembled with anger and threw the letter in her hand at Charles. Charles VII was in a dilemma. At this moment, Joan had become too powerful. After much thought, he came up with the idea of killing someone with a borrowed knife. He then ordered Joan to attack Burgundy. However, Joan was abandoned and locked out of the city by her own people. Joan was surrounded by enemies, and her soldiers were all killed. She herself was captured by the Burgundians. The Duke of Burgundy was overjoyed. The legendary saint had been captured by him, and he planned to sell her for a huge profit. For France, Joan's value was immeasurable. The French soldiers and the people of Orleans spontaneously raised 10,000 gold crowns, hoping to ransom Joan. But Charles VII did not use this money to ransom her. Instead, he tacitly allowed Joan to be sold to the English. The Duke of Bedford immediately sent Joan to the ecclesiastical court, hoping to have her executed. The chief judge wanted to find fault with Joan, but although she was disheartened, she refused to change her beliefs. Deeply moved, the chief judge did not want to participate in such a hypocritical trial. He wanted to report truthfully to the Roman Church but was controlled by the English. Helplessly, the chief judge racked his brains to try to help Joan avoid punishment, but what Joan did not know was that at the moment she signed, her past would be at odds with God. In the dead of night, the Duke of Bedford specially sent someone to give Joan men's clothes. The English tore Joan's clothes to shreds, and Joan, not daring to be naked, had to put on the men's clothes. The Duke of Bedford used this as an excuse, and without any confession, Joan was convicted of 12 major crimes and burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, at the age of 19. She led France to freedom, but returned home in this way. In 1453, the 100 Years' War ended with France's victory. 500 years later, the Roman Church exonerated Joan and canonized her as a saint in the Vatican. This film is based on true historical events. Joan has an indelible place in French history.